The palace stood in breathtaking silence beneath the moon, its golden domes reflecting a calm that only looked like peace from afar. Inside those walls, where chandeliers glimmered like frozen stars, there lived a secret the world would never hear, a melody too tender for politics, too sacred for history. Sheikh Hamdan, the poet prince of Dubai, carried a silence deeper than the sea, a longing that neither time nor throne could erase. In the palace of secrets, her name still ruled his dreams, and even the walls seemed to remember the rhythm of her laughter. He had learned to hide his heart behind ceremony and grace, speaking with the authority of a ruler but feeling with the fragility of a poet. The world adored his strength, his words, his vision, yet they never saw the way his eyes softened when the night returned. They never noticed how his smile dimmed when music filled the halls, for that was when memory came to dance. In those quiet hours, his composure slipped away, and the man beneath the crown emerged, the dreamer who still whispered her name like prayer. She had been the secret note in his unfinished symphony, the sound his heart searched for in every echo. She was the melody he wrote but never performed, the verse he could only recite to the moon. Her presence had once turned his world into harmony, now her absence turned it into art. The courtiers saw perfection in his every move, but perfection was his disguise, poetry was his confession. He ruled with dignity, but he loved with surrender, and that love still lived in the spaces between his breath and his silence. Every night, when the palace slept, Fazza walked through its marble corridors as if tracing a path through memory. His fingers would brush the railings she once touched, his footsteps soft against the same floors where they once shared words too pure for daylight. The air carried a whisper of jasmine, her favorite scent, though no one could explain its presence. It was as if the palace itself conspired to keep her alive within its walls, letting her haunt his senses with grace, not grief. In the grand hall stood a piano, untouched for years, its surface gleaming with the reflection of moonlight through arched windows. That piano had been her favorite place, where her hands once created music that could quiet even his restless thoughts. One night, unable to resist, Fazza sat before it again. He pressed a single key, soft, hesitant, and the sound filled the room like a sigh. The melody came back to him slowly, trembling through his fingers, every note a memory, every chord a confession. It was her song, their song. And though no one was there to hear it, the night applauded with the sound of wind and tears. He often wondered if love ever truly leaves or if it simply changes form, hiding itself in the things we can't forget. She had vanished from his world but not from his essence. He saw her reflection in the glass when dawn painted the desert gold, in the rhythm of his horse's gallop, in the poems that wrote themselves when he tried to stay silent. Her absence had not erased her, it had carved her deeper into him. She had become his echo, his shadow, his silent queen. The poets of the kingdom often asked him where he found the sorrow in his words, the ache that made every line shimmer with truth. He would smile softly and say, "Pain is just love that stayed behind. They didn't understand, how could they?" His poetry was his confession to her, disguised in metaphors of rain and stars, the only way he could still speak her name without defying fate. In every stanza, she lived again, not as memory, but as melody. Sometimes he stood by his window, looking out at the endless desert under the blanket of stars. The vastness reminded him of her, beautiful, untouchable, eternal. The wind would rise and brush his face as if carrying her whisper across time. "I never left, I only became what you loved." In those moments, the loneliness turned holy, and he felt her presence not as pain, but as poetry made flesh. The night would hold him gently, as though heaven itself mourned with him. He had loved her not for how she looked, but for what she awakened within him, a courage to feel, to surrender, to write without armor. She had taught him that strength isn't in silence, but in sincerity, not in hiding your heart, but in living with it open. Though the world could never know their story, it could feel it.
There were nights when the moon lingered longer above the royal palace, as if it too was listening to the echoes of their love. Fazza would stand beneath its light, his eyes reflecting both strength and sorrow, and the desert wind would wrap around him like her invisible embrace. He would speak to the night softly, not as a prince, not as a poet, but as a man still haunted by the gentlest memory of her smile. Every grain of sand seemed to remember her footsteps, every breeze carried her perfume, and every silence spoke her name. The palace might have belonged to him, but his dreams still belonged entirely to her. In his private chamber, where golden curtains swayed like whispers, he kept a small wooden box, untouched by anyone but him. Inside were fragments of a love story too sacred for display, a letter she had written in ink that had long faded, a strand of her hair sealed in glass, a pressed flower from the garden where they once met at dawn. These were not possessions but relics, pieces of a world that time could not erase. Whenever his heart grew heavy, he would open the box, close his eyes, and remember the way she loved, soft, fearless, like poetry set free. Sometimes, in his poems, he wrote of stars falling into oceans, of kings who traded crowns for love, of deserts blooming in rain, but only he knew the truth behind the metaphors. Each verse was a message to her, each metaphor a hidden promise. The world read them as art, but they were his way of keeping her alive. Even when his advisors praised his eloquence, he would simply nod, for how could he explain that every word was written with a heartbeat, not a pen? His verses were his offerings to a love that had transcended time, a devotion wrapped in language too delicate for the world to truly grasp. On certain evenings, when the palace musicians played, he would excuse himself and walk into the gardens where the moonlight fell like lace. There among the roses she once adored, he would hear faint music, the echo of her laughter, the rhythm of her heartbeat blending with the rustle of leaves. It was in those moments he realized she had never left. She had simply become part of everything that lived around him. The stars were her eyes, the breeze her breath, the stillness her soul resting within his own. He began to believe that love like theirs never sought to be seen, it simply sought to be felt. It didn't crave recognition, nor validation, it existed beyond reason, beyond mortal language. When he ruled his people with compassion, it was her kindness speaking through him. When he wrote of forgiveness, it was her patience guiding his hand. Even the way he smiled at children carried a shadow of her warmth. She had become his unseen crown, the light that gave his title meaning. Without her, power was empty, with her memory, even silence was divine. As years passed, Fazza grew into a legend, not just as a leader, but as a poet whose heart spoke in verses the world would quote for centuries.